If every country in the world is in debt, who exactly is the money owed to? It's a question that seems simple, but the answer reveals how the entire global economy works and why the world runs on borrowing. We hear it in the news every day. The US national debt has crossed $34 trillion. The UK, France, Germany, China, all are buried in debt. Even the world's richest countries owe massive amounts of money. And then there are poorer nations, some of them so deep in debt that they've spent decades just trying to pay off the interest. So if every nation is in debt, who are they borrowing from? Is there some invisible lender we don't hear about? A global bank in the shadows? Or is it something else entirely? To understand this, we need to know what national debt actually is. When a country runs a deficit, meaning it spends more than it collects in taxes, it needs to borrow the difference to keep running. Governments do this by issuing bonds. A bond is basically a promise. The government says, "Lend me this money, and I'll pay you back later with interest." These bonds are then bought by investors, banks, pension funds, foreign governments, and even everyday citizens. In fact, in many countries, a large part of the national debt is actually owned by the people of that country. Take the United States, for example. Of its $34 trillion debt, about 70% is owned domestically. That means Americans own most of the debt through pension funds, banks, mutual funds, and retirement accounts. When you contribute to your pension, some of that money likely goes into government bonds. So in a sense, the US owes money to itself. But there are also foreign lenders. Countries like Japan and China own a significant amount of US debt, although less than many people think. China holds about $860 billion of US debt. Japan holds slightly more. But together, foreign governments own just about 25 to 30% of America's debt. The same is true for other wealthy nations. The UK, for example, owes most of its debt to British institutions, banks, and citizens. Japan has the highest debt-to-GDP ratio in the world, more than 260%, but almost all of it is held domestically. But not every country is in the same position. Developing nations often borrow from wealthier countries, international banks, or institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. These loans are meant to help build infrastructure, hospitals, or stabilize economies, but they come with high interest rates and strict repayment terms. Many poorer countries have found themselves trapped in cycles of debt, where they borrow money just to pay off the interest on previous loans. This has created a form of economic dependency where large portions of national budgets go to debt repayments instead of healthcare, education, or development. Countries like Argentina, Sri Lanka, and Lebanon have faced full-blown debt crises in recent years, where they simply couldn't pay back what they owed. When that happens, the economy collapses, inflation skyrockets, and living standards plummet. Globally, the world's total debt, when you include governments, businesses, and households, is now more than $300 trillion. That's 3 times the size of the global economy. It might sound unsustainable, but the system keeps going because debt isn't just a burden, it's an investment for someone else. If a government borrows money, that debt becomes someone else's asset. Pension funds need government bonds because they're relatively safe. Banks invest in them. Insurance companies buy them. Even foreign governments purchase them to store value and stabilize their currencies. For example, China buys US debt to keep its own currency stable and to maintain a trade surplus. This system ties countries together economically, creating mutual dependencies that encourage stability, at least in theory. But there's another layer to this. Many central banks, including the US Federal Reserve, the Bank of England, and the Bank of Japan, own large amounts of their own country's debt. The Bank of Japan owns nearly half of all Japanese government debt. The US Federal Reserve holds trillions in US bonds. This is sometimes called monetizing the debt, where the central bank creates new money to buy government bonds. This can help lower borrowing costs for governments and inject money into the economy, especially during times of crisis. But critics warn that creating too much money can lead to inflation or distort financial markets. So when we ask, who is the debt owed to, the answer is not one mysterious lender. It's a network of institutions, banks, funds, foreign governments, and the citizens themselves. Countries owe money to their own people through pensions and investments. They owe money to foreign investors. They owe to global institutions like the IMF and World Bank. And in some cases, they owe it to themselves via their central banks. But there's a dark side. In wealthy countries, National debt often circulates within the domestic economy. But for poorer countries, debt can be a form of control. Wealthy nations and global institutions can demand policy changes in exchange for debt relief or new loans. That can mean cutting social spending, privatizing public services, or opening markets to foreign investors, often at the expense of local populations. Debt can become a tool of economic power, a way for rich nations and financial institutions to influence the politics and economies of the developing world. This dynamic has led some to call it a modern form of colonialism, not through military power, but through financial dependency. So while debt is often portrayed as a problem, it's also the foundation of how the global economy works. Without debt, governments couldn't build infrastructure, fund research, or respond to crises. Companies couldn't grow, and people couldn't buy homes or get educated. The problem isn't debt itself, it's how it's managed and who controls the terms. If managed well, debt can drive growth, innovation, and prosperity. If mismanaged, it can lead to collapse, inequality, and poverty. At the global level, debt is a balancing act. As long as economies grow, debts can be paid off, or at least managed. But if growth stalls, or if too much wealth flows upward into the hands of a few, the system becomes fragile. Because for every debtor, there is a lender. For every nation in debt, there is someone profiting off that debt. And the real danger comes when those lenders lose confidence, or when borrowers can no longer keep up. That's when defaults happen, when economies crash, and when the world realizes just how much of it was built on promises that may never be repaid. So when we ask if every country is in debt, who is the money owed to, the answer is all around us, in banks, pensions, investments, and foreign reserves. But maybe the more important question is, how long can this system hold? And what happens when it doesn't?